Let me tell you a story the headlines won't dare. A quiet storm gathering across oceans. A slow and silent revolution that's shaking boardrooms in Brussels, collapsing budgets in Paris, and haunting the corridors of old European power. Once Europe was the master of global wealth, not because it had more, but because it took more. From the gold mines of Ghana to the palm plantations and cobalt of Congo to the diamond fields of South Africa, Europe's prosperity was carved from the soul of Africa. They came in ships, they came with flags, they came with Bibles in one hand and contracts in the other. They told stories of civilization while chaining kingdoms. They called it trade. We called it theft, and for decades, centuries even, the game never really changed. Africa supplied, Europe sold, Africa borrowed, Europe dictated. But the tide is turning. In 2025, across African capitals, something unfamiliar is stirring. Confidence. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, Lusaka to Lagos, the continent is no longer begging for inclusion. It's building its own table, its own trade, its own terms. And Europe is panicking. In France, inflation is climbing like a slow-burning fire. In Italy, industries are on life support. In Germany, manufacturers are begging for raw materials no longer flowing from Africa like they used to. Why? Because Africa has stopped playing its old role. No longer the dumping ground of expired policies and toxic loans. No longer a charity case for IMF handouts. No longer the silent partner in global trade. Today's Africa is unrecognizable to those who still think of it in colonial terms. Let's look at Ghana, once just a cocoa field for European chocolate empires. Now, it's building state-of-the-art processing plants. No more exporting raw beans, no more middlemen. Now Ghana makes the chocolate, Ghana owns the brand. In Rwanda, data centers rise where colonial barracks once stood. Tech startups sprout faster than coffee beans. Engineers code in Kinyarwanda, write in Python, and dream in 5G. They're not waiting for Silicon Valley. They're building their own valley on African soil. And in Nigeria, Africa's economic engine, they're not exporting crude oil like before. They're building refineries, mega ones. Dangote's name rings louder than Shell's. For every sector once monopolized by European firms, Africa is placing a stake. But Europe, it didn't see this coming. You see, Europe built its wealth on one simple equation: cheap resources plus cheap labor, unlimited profit. But Africa has learned the equation too, and now it's changing the variables. What happens when the supplier refuses to supply on someone else's terms? What happens when the colonized refuses to play colonized? Europe is learning the hard way. In Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, the French flags are being lowered by force if necessary. French companies are being expelled. Military bases shut down. Uranium mines nationalized. The people aren't just resisting, they're rewriting the script. In West Africa, the CFA Franc, once a symbol of French economic control, is being buried. Countries are saying enough. No more currency tied to the French treasury. No more economic shackles disguised as stability. And without African uranium, without West African reserves, Europe's energy future looks grim. That's why electricity is more expensive in Paris. That's why factories in Lyon are halting production. That's why the euro is trembling. But the panic doesn't stop there. Europe's politicians are calling emergency summits. Brussels is throwing billions into aid and partnership deals. But Africa isn't biting, because for once, it doesn't need to. Why? Because Africa has choices. China, India, Brazil, Russia. The BRICS bloc is now more attractive than the G7. They're offering infrastructure, technology, and trade without moral lectures. And Africa is listening. Even Turkey is gaining ground where France is losing grip. Even the Gulf states are building smart cities where once only Paris or London dared invest. Europe spent years training African economists to speak their language, but now Africa is learning to speak its own. Africa is trading in local currencies, in digital tokens, in yuan, in gold, anything but the euro. And every time an African country ditches the euro for trade, Europe takes a hit. Not just in the markets, but in the mirror. Because Europe's crisis is not just about money. It's about identity. For too long, Europe believed it was the standard, the center of reason, the father of civilization, the lender, the leader, the light. But what happens when the student surpasses the master, when the so-called third world becomes the first choice? Young Africans no longer dream of escaping to Europe. They dream of staying and building. They want to be founders, not freelancers. Landowners, not tenants. Policymakers, not policy receivers. This is the nightmare European strategists didn't plan for. They feared mass migration. But the real threat is mass awakening. They feared African warlords, but now they face African negotiators who know the worth of every barrel of oil, every gram of lithium, every acre of fertile soil. And they can't manipulate them anymore. Because Africa is not looking for favors. It's looking for fairness. And in this new world, Europe is the one asking for deals. Europe is the one making promises it can't keep. Europe is the one writing op-eds about lost influence, while Africa builds the future. From Pan-African banks to continent-wide digital IDs, from continental free trade zones to sovereign-controlled energy markets, Africa is no longer knocking on the door. Africa is building the house. And for the first time since the Industrial Revolution, Europe is out of business. Not bankrupt in cash, but bankrupt in control, because the age of African dependency is over, and the age of African destiny has begun. So when you hear about Europe's financial collapse, don't be fooled by the headlines. It's not just inflation, it's not just recession, it's not just war, it's justice, historical, economic, poetic. Europe isn't falling because Africa rose violently. Europe is falling because Africa stood up, peacefully, powerfully, and permanently. This is not revenge. This is realignment. This is not Africa taking what isn't theirs. This is Africa reclaiming what was always theirs. And in that reclamation lies the birth of a new world, one where Africa no longer whispers, it roars. And Europe must now listen.